Have you ever been out in the desert?
Or have you felt like you were lost in the desert inside your own soul?
What is this desert experience?
And what does it teach us about who we are?
I'm David Denny,
I'm Tessa Bilecki.
and this is Fire and Light.
Conversations about life, love, and soul.
Welcome, everyone, to the month of June. This is what we call dry summer here in Tucson.
And we've just come home from a retreat with a wonderful group of people from the Center for Spiritual Imagination, which is centered in New York City on Long Island. And people came from the Northwest, from the Northeast, and they had never been in the Sonoran Desert before. Introducing them to the desert was an amazing experience and the inspiration for the theme of this podcast.
There were several people who had never been in the desert before. It was wonderful to watch them responding.
Yes, watch them
We
wake
took
up.
them out right at dawn.
Yeah, 2 mornings out in the saguaros before the sun came up. There's something about the desert that has a really profound effect on people, we think, and also Edward Abbey, the author of Desert Solitaire, totally agrees. After living in the Red Rock Canyon lands of southern Utah, he said, there's something in the desert which the mountains, no matter how grand they are, no matter how beautiful, lack, which the sea, no matter how shining and vast and old, does not have. He also went on to say, this may be my favorite description of the experience of the desert. Abbey said, life nowhere appears so brave, so bright, so full of oracle and miracle as in the desert. And I always want to add beautiful there.
Yeah.
So bright, so brave, so beautiful, which is the title of my post on tessabilecki.com this month, my reflections on the desert. Joy Harjo, the first Native American poet laureate of the United States, said, if you look with the mind of the swirling earth. And I love how, as a Native American, she can talk about our minds, our eyes, seeing with the look of the land. She said, you actually become the land. You become the land and you become beautiful. That kind of intimacy with the land, specifically desert land, is what we're going to be talking about in this podcast and why it relates to you no matter where you live.
Yes, some of you may have never had any time in a physical, real desert. And so we'll talk about that. And I know white people tend to think of it as a desolate place. Tony Hillerman, who wrote a bunch of wonderful books about New Mexico and the Navajo, he said that it's the white folks, it's the Europeans who think of the desert as desolation. But for the Navajo, for example, the land is a beautiful valley. Or for the local people here around Tucson, the Tohono O'odham of the Sonoran Desert, they call it a bright, shining place.
And how did the Shoshone people that we heard about I think we already told people this when we talked about Death Valley, but for those of you who didn't hear that podcast on Death Valley, how do they respond to the land?
They're kind of shocked that we outsiders would call it Death Valley. For them, they're called the Timbisha Shoshone, and Timbisha is a reference to the beautiful red earth and the red rock that is there in that valley. So for them, it's the Timbisha, the home of their beautiful land.
And it's not dead, but it's alive.
Terry Tempest Williams, whom you might have run into in your reading, is a Utah resident, and she also senses that sacredness of this kind of beautiful, open, seemingly sparse land. She wrote in a book called Red that if the desert is holy, it is because it's a forgotten place and allows us to remember the sacred. And I just think that's one of the big sins of our day is we forget the sacred.
And what makes the desert so sacred? Part of the reason that it is so sacred arises from its silence. We were really struck with our retreatants when we went out at that hour before the sun rose, how we were surrounded by silence. I mean, the silence of human caused sound. Of course, there's sound in the desert. You're hearing all the birds, maybe the call of a coyote, but it's silent of human-made sound. So Abbey said in those canyon lands of Utah that he lost himself in that immense silence. That's how I feel when I'm out there. Annie Lamont said that silence is a crystal silence that's very uplifting, and it will uplift you if it doesn't unhinge you, like it did a woman that we met last spring by the name of Kim Haynes Eitzen. And she went to Death Valley to record the silences there for a study that she was doing on the deserts. And she went to deserts all over the world. But in Death Valley, when she was in Titus Canyon, she found the stillness there so unsettling that she started to clap just so she could hear some kind of noise, some kind of reverberations against the canyon walls, which makes me want to go to Titus Canyon next time I go to Death Valley because I want to hear that kind of silence. You know, we tend to think of silence as an absence. It's an absence of noise, but she suggests that we think of silence as a fullness, that it's the fullness of quiet, which is a very positive way to look at it, the fullness of quiet. And then she uses the expression a blooming attention. So we're not only paying attention, but the attention and the silence are so rich that they bloom, they flower. And she also describes silence as moments when time slows down. And certainly in our fast-paced society, one of the things we need more than anything is to slow down. And that's what silence does. Now, there's another aspect of the desert that I love, and we were very aware of this. Walking in the desert, we spent at least an hour there each morning, and there's no place to sit down. There are no trees that you can lean against. There's no smooth grass. Everything's prickly and sharp, and there are stinging insects. There's no place to hide out in this vast landscape of the desert. So you end up, it's so vast, it's so huge. I love what another Utah resident, her name is Ellen Malloy, and she and Terry Tempest Williams really stand out in the literature of the desert because not many women write about the desert. It's usually men. So Ellen Malloy and Terry Tempest Williams are two of the most important voices. Ellen Malloy says, when I'm out there, I feel like a small dot and a big voyeur. And I love that juxtaposition, that the land, the openness of the sky and the desert are so enormous. Who would even know that we were out there?
It's humbling. And that's one of the virtues that, of course, the desert fathers and mothers discovered in the desert. And it seems to me that that's one of the things that, ironically, I think a lot of we religious types haven't seemed to grasp that. I think the mystics are great because they always talk about the closer one gets to God, the less one knows. And it seems to me that that's what happens also in the desert. Ideas break down, notions, images break down, and we realize just how small and how puny all our ideas are. And so we stop fighting about them. So I think humility is really a good thing about the desert. For example, this guide in the Sahara who said, it's so huge. The horizons are so distant. They make a person feel small, as if he should remain silent. And that's from somebody who knows the desert really, really well. So you go from somebody like a Bedouin in the Sahara to a woman in the New York Times recently. Her name was Meg Bernhardt. She spent some time in the desert and wrote about it. And she says, there we are reminded of our transience, our impermanence. This is the meaning of geological time. We're not just living by a clock. We start to sense when we're around those stones that are so ancient and those mountains that are ancient. We're here a pretty short time. So she says, our bodies will die, but the rocks and sand will go on.
So some people find that sad, but you and I, Dave, as desert rats, we find that consoling. Now, why is that?
Well, sometimes I find it sad. I remember when my parents died, and I thought, it doesn't really matter to the universe, and there was something sad about that.
Yeah,
but
that's
it's
true.
Also, there's something beautiful about that we sometimes over dramatize everything, and nature has sort of taken it in stride.
Did we read a book about this very thing?
Yes, it's called The Solace of Fierce Landscapes by a guy named Belden Lane, whose mother was dying of Alzheimer's disease. His discovery of going out into the wilderness to deal with the grief over the loss of his mother. And he found that surrounding of stark beauty was deeply, deeply healing.
And he asked himself a question.
He says, how did the wild canyon cliff change when your world fell apart? And of course, it didn't.
It didn't. And so that constancy, the immensity and constancy for him was consoling.
Yeah.
And I actually find that myself.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly if I'm having a bad day, heading out for the vastness of this saguaro land that we live in here energizes me and consoles me and heals me in very profound ways. So it changes me. And that was the title of Bernhardt's article. And what was so fascinating about her is that here she is, a New York resident. I mean, as urban as you can get. She said, the desert changed my life, and it can change yours too. And here's what she meant by that, is that it reminded her, like it does that camel driver, like it did Ellen Malloy, Small Dot, it reminded Meg Bernhardt that she was small and she was mortal, and that was good for her to realize. Mm-hmm. So, and the other thing that was so important was she learned what she called the ecological dimension of time in the desert, and by that she means that we learn that we're part of the desert. We're part of the landscape. We're not separate from it. Mm-hmm. We're part of it. As Joy Harjo says, we become that land. We become the land. And Terry Tempest Williams takes this even farther. She echoes that same wisdom of becoming the land, but then she says there are social ramifications to connecting with the desert. She said for her, it always comes back to the land. Everything comes back to the land. And she believes very strongly, and I totally agree with her, that when we lack intimacy with the land, then that results in a lack of intimacy with one another. And if we are close to the land, experiencing the land with reverence, then we will also be close to one another, take better care of one another, and feel reverence for one another. And then she goes so far as to say that every time we make a pilgrimage into the desert, we're really making a pilgrimage to the self. Again, because the land and ourselves are one. That's how she put it in her great book called Red, which is actually a compilation of essays. Now, here's another woman talking about the desert. Georgia O'Keeffe, the famous painter, painted the desert around Abiquiu, New Mexico. And she said, The desert makes me feel like myself. Again, pilgrimage to the desert is a pilgrimage to self. The desert made her feel like herself, and she said, I like that. She liked herself, and she loved painting the desert. But what happens if what we learn about ourselves in our experience of the desert reveals something that we don't like about ourselves?
Mm.
And there are a lot of wisdom teachings that come out of that experience, so that the desert is not only consoling, but it's very challenging. As one Carmelite teacher said, it can swallow you up emotionally as well as spiritually. So there's another aspect to the desert besides its beauty, besides its stillness, besides the good lesson of humility. There are times when the desert is like a battlefield where we feel like a struggle is taking place inside
Mhm.
ourselves.
Yeah, I know some of those old hermits in the early Christian church, for example, talked about spiritual warfare that takes place in the desert. And of course, in Christian scripture, you have Jesus struggling with the dark forces in the desert. So that's a big part of what happened in the desert. There's another woman named Mary Earle who writes about some of the desert mothers. And Earle says the desert tradition cuts to the chase. The desert is a call to be real.
Yeah, real. I think that's so important.
So, in a sparse landscape, it's hard to fool ourselves. In an empty natural setting, we come face to face with our own limitations and mortality. So, humility can be liberating, but on the way, it can be terrifying.
Yeah, painful,
Mhm.
painful. So, a lot of these insights that we're sharing with you come from desert rats like us, people who love what the desert teaches because they've lived there. But not everyone is called to live in the physical desert. So, it's important also to mention and even to focus on the fact that the desert experience is essentially an inner experience. There's an inner desert where each one of us, one day or another, sooner or later, that's where we're going to end up. So that the desert is not only a geographical place, but it's a state of soul.
Mhm.
It's a place inside ourselves that is empty, it's solitary, it's a place of testing, even. We learn how to test ourselves. So, not everyone can or should live like a hermit the way I do in my urban hermitage, but no one can do without an inner hermitage, no matter where you live. And I think that was part of what our friends on retreat this weekend from very, very urban environments, what they learned, that they carry an inner hermitage inside them, a cave of the heart, and that is where we encounter divine presence. So that the word desert basically and most fundamentally really means the search for God or the search for the sacred in silence. And even somebody, Edward Abbey is such an old curmudgeon. I love that guy. He doesn't consider himself either religious or even spiritual. Of course, I think he is. He's a very secular guy. But even he calls the desert the locus Dei, or the place of God. So for most of us, the desert isn't the wilderness of the Sahara, but it really means time alone with God wherever it is that we live. So we all have the desert in our everyday lives, and what we think of as the sand or the sun or the rocks or the heat of the desert takes other forms. That can mean illness, loss, the death of a loved one, the loss of a job that thrusts us into a kind of emptiness, deprivations of all kind, mental anguish, addiction, abandonment, loneliness. These are all human experiences that we share. These are all deserts. And this is really what we mean by the inner desert or the desert experience.
And I think it's important when you talk about some of these more difficult aspects of the desert to remember that it's always considered a place that you pass through, not necessarily the end of the story. Or you have poets like the prophet Isaiah talking about how the desert comes to blossom at some point. So there is this sense of fecundity in the desert. And if we look at of course, the Jewish tradition, you're in the desert after getting out of slavery, but before you arrive in that promised land. So it is a transitional kind of a place. And that's important, I think, for people to remember. And it helps then give us strength and fortitude to make it through the desert, knowing that something beautiful lies at the other side.
But in order to get there, in order to get to that promised land, we have to cross the desert, or as someone once said, and you may remember that the Hebrew people take 40 years to cross the Sinai Desert to get to the promised land. So someone once wrote, yeah, we may get to that promised land, but we have to know what it feels like to chew sand for 40 years before we get to that feast in the promised land. And I love that because we all know what it feels like to have sand in our mouths. Put down our teeth on sand at the beach. It's a terrible experience. So when this guy talks about chewing sand for 40 years, that's to me a very vivid metaphor for what it feels like to suffer some of the things that we have to suffer to get to the promised land. So I've certainly found that to be true. I've had to chew sand for a long time, whether we're talking about time in the physical desert or the inner deserts that I've been through in my life. But that's not the end. As you say, we pass through it. So I think it's important to remember that whether we're living in the Sahara like that camel driver or in San Francisco, whether we go to the Mojave like Meg Bernhardt or we live in Madagascar, whether we go to the Gobi Desert or live in Galway Bay, the desert is basically the same. You don't have to experience that physical desert because all of us here, through the prophet Isaiah, the great Hebrew prophet Isaiah, we hear God's call in the intimate depths of our hearts. And that call is to all of us. And what is that call? That call is, I will lead you into the desert, and there I will speak to your heart. So, our practice for this month is to reflect on our experience of the desert. Is it an outward journey that you made? Did you make a pilgrimage to the physical desert? Can you do that? Can you allow yourself to take a summer vacation, a hard time of year to visit the desert? Or reflect on your inner desert experience. Sometime when you really struggled, you felt like your heart was a battlefield. You felt like you were crossing the Sinai Desert and chewing sand for 40 years. Think about that. And what did that teach you? What did you learn? And we're going to take you on a pilgrimage to the desert now for our meditation and set us up for that meditation, Dave.
Okay. Well, these are some thoughts that came to me after our recent mornings in the desert. So I would ask you to find a comfortable position. Take some deep breaths. And think about how it feels to wake up early on a quiet morning. And there's no traffic. No one else is awake. And you enter that quiet space. It is just before dawn as you stand in the cool desert. On your left, a steep butte protects you from the light that will soon strike.
And above you, in a pale silver sky, the oblong moon, the waning moon, floats above you.
As your foot touches the gravelly earth, the crunch sounds loud in the silence. But then it isn't silent, is it? Before and behind you, birds make music.
A skinny lizard skitters ahead of you on the path, and further on, a soft young cottontail rabbit disappears into the rattle bush.
You wend between the sticky green leaves and furry globe pods of creosote bushes. Meander past a cactus called cholla, whose tight red petals unclench like opening fists.
And a short, fat barrel cactus bristles with needles that are bent like fish hooks. And all around you, above all the undergrowing brush and the prickly pear cactus, saguaro cactus tower.
To the west, where the sun first strikes a rocky hill, you see their tall columns glow. Here, in the low, shaded path, their smooth-ribbed, needle-ridged torsos look dark against the sky.
A woodpecker disappears into a hole high in the saguaro's side, and her hungry nestlings cheer from inside their shelter.
You stop. You listen. You wonder at the vast family of giants, saguaros with arms reaching into the brightened sky.
Some with arms swooping groundward. One reaches down to you and gives you a bouquet of waxy white flowers.
A gift. A month from now, in extreme heat, these blossoms swell to bright red, sticky, seed-filled fruit for the saguaro's beloved relatives.
The saguaro's relatives, the Tohono O'odham, the desert people, for whom this is not a wasteland, but a bright, shining place, life.
You know and feel the pain, too, within, beyond this shining miracle, where saguaro ribs and netted cholla bones turn to dust.
And still, you send the peace you feel, the peace of dawn, out to all the grieving corners of our wounded earth, to all those who suffer this day.
Here, now, you listen. You are small, protected by giants. Do you hear a voice in your heart?
Thank you for listening. If you want to go deeper into what we've shared with you in this podcast, check out our websites, tessabalecki.com.
And sandandsky.org.
Share this podcast with your friends. Tell them that we're now on YouTube and on Facebook.
That's right. And if you visit sandandsky.org and want to support us, just push that donate button.
Thank you in advance. You've been listening to Fire and Light.
Conversations on life, love, and soul.
The background music for Fire and Light is The Day We Met, composed and performed by Ricky Zhao.
Fire and Light's theme music is Dreamcatcher, composed and performed by Chris Martin and Jeff Harvey at Purple Planet Music.
Fire and Light is recorded in Tucson, Arizona, editing by David Levin.